Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast, the place where design and development overlap. Brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the program. Today, I'm going to be talking with Zach Hendershot and Aaron Stone. They're with Crux Digital. Zach is the managing partner, and Aaron Stone is the founder. Welcome to the program, guys. Glad to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about what a managing partner and a founder of an agency like Crux does.
Well, I'll start. So our job and our responsibility, right, is to help our clients solve really difficult technical problems. And so, my job within Crux really is to help focus the right work, the right engagement, the right solution to the problem that our clients are trying to solve, and make sure that we are set up in a way to help them really solve that problem effectively and efficiently. That's it at the end of the day. That trickles into a bunch of different skills and conversations and actions, but I think that's the gist of what my day-to-day looks like.
Yep. Yeah. And for me, I'm just trying to make sure that the best people are under our roof. So we're really a collective of folks that provide a lot of senior level delivery around design driven products and focusing on being able to operationalize really great design.
Awesome. And Crux has built a design system or three in its time, which is why we obviously wanted to chat with you guys today. Is you have a lot of experience working with design systems across a variety of organizations and in a variety of contexts. Can you guys tell me a little bit about the work you do, specifically as it relates to design systems, so we can get a kind of an understanding of who you work with, what do you do in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So historically, we've worked primarily with Fortune 1000. It seems to be our sweet spot in delivery. On design system front, we've done things kind of financial services, renewable energy, telecom, things like that. And typically what we'll do is we'll engage with product ownership and try and align the requirements that are kind of going around to the teams who are the consumers of this, understanding kind of the product level elements of how do you actually design, strategize, build, and deliver something like this all the way from design all the way to the point of being consumed.
And when did you guys first start working with design systems? And I say this out of love because I actually started an agency that was focused exclusively on working on design systems for a while. And, we did that like circa 2017. And I'm always kind of curious where other folks have landed on that front.
It's funny. The 2017 number is actually right around when we started to look at it. We kind of the Brad Frostisms were starting to come into the world, and everybody was thinking about atomic design. And there was all this kind of, how do you operationalize something across legacy components or legacy applications and marketing applications and future-facing applications? And how do we actually take all of those things and create economies of scale around components and consistency within a brand?
Yeah, and I've been looking at design systems probably about the same time as well. We were Aaron and I were both at a previous agency before Crux, and it was primarily a design agency, and we were really looking at it through the lens of like, how do we solve a problem? And the problem is all these great designs that exist within the work and the engagements that we're engaged with our clients. How do we make that impactful in the business? And so we started to get really early stage interested in how to create reusable components out of it, how to scale it within an organization and enterprise, and we've kind of carried that forward over the last few years in terms of really optimizing how we think about it and how we put pen to paper on the tools and the process and the messaging around it.
Yeah. And interestingly, in that stage of things, we were actually thinking about it selfishly, right? A lot of that was, we have lots of clients we're serving and a lot of opportunity to reduce the amount of time it takes us to do what we do for our clients. And we hadn't at that point, I think, really put the lens on how can our clients do this to help themselves, and how can we help our clients to do that? So I think that's the evolution of this from where we started to how we've seen this evolve within the walls of some of our clients.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because not every agency necessarily embraces this idea. I think that, agency models have largely been based around the legacy models or the traditional models that we've used to build products. And oftentimes agencies either are looking at this from a self-interested perspective, which I think is fine. Everybody wants to build things for their clients faster. But oftentimes when customers start to implement design systems, that's seen almost like a threat, because that means like less billable work for an agency. How do you guys kind of wrestle with that concept?
Yeah, in fact, I remember very early stages. I was a part of many sales efforts on a lot of this work, and that was the early fear in us as an agency selling this work to these clients. But at the end of the day, once we start to build them, once we start to deploy them, they came back to us, right? And they came back to us for a couple of different reasons. They came back to us because, one, they needed to up-level themselves in terms of how to think in a reusable, structured way that is not a typical way in which they think about engaging and building digital products in a lot of these organizations. So we were able to help them, really up-level their internal skills and capabilities, but also their way of thinking and the way of acting in terms of building and scaling, design and experience within their digital products. But then secondarily, right, it brought immense value to their business in terms of efficiency improvements and scale. They wanted more of that in other parts of their business, right? And so for us, it was one of those situations where, yes, it maybe shortened the window on that one work stream, but opened a very large window of a bunch of additional work streams to help make them faster, leaner, meaner, and just more efficient as a broader organization. And word spread. And that's what was the value of doing this at scale in these organizations.
Yeah, I would add also that, the threat that you could get, everybody sort of, whether it's on the agency side or it's internally within an organization consuming a design system, there is a bit of threat to your role and what do you do here, right? And on the agency side, maybe that's a threat to how much work can we do and how much can we bill for and how much can we build from scratch. But what can you do when you're actually raising your gaze from building buttons over and over again or building accordions the same way again? Like if you actually have a lot of that stuff provided to you, it's not necessarily that you're being threatened that you're not building that. It's that you're given the opportunity to not have to build that. And you start to think about, what is the business value I'm adding? What am I thinking about from a product standpoint to provide more value to my team, to my product, to my customers? There's a lot more opportunity that comes out there.
I love that take. I think that that's a great way of thinking about how, an agency's problems and their customers, clients' problems are very much aligned, right? If you're solving the things that your clients care about and you're aligned to their value, ultimately that provides more opportunities for you to deliver value for them. And I think that that's great. And I agree that there's an analog sort of inside of design teams or engineering teams now that, like, what do I do with my hands if I'm not doing the thing that I've always done before? And I think that that's what really makes design systems represent this big step change in the way we think about building product.
Yeah, and we've heard this thought a lot about, okay, are you working me out of a job, right? If my job is to continue to build the same component over and over again across a number of different products, and that's my job within the business, right? And a design system circumvents your ability to, ultimately, scale yourself, right? It's going to create a bunch of different things within that organization. And it may be a long-term thing where these folks, really get burned out because they're doing the same thing or aren't having the impact that they want within the organization, or, just get tired of doing that same thing over and over again and leave the organization. And otherwise they're a great piece of talent within that organization and they don't want to lose them. So this, I think, in my opinion, gives the teams within these organizations the ability to scale themselves as well. And so if we can tell that story as a part of our engagements, right, that it not only helps your operational efficiency, but it helps the scale and efficiency of the people in your business and help them learn new skills, try new things, work across different products, help the business grow in more effective, efficient ways. I think that's a great story too. That's more nuanced and more complicated to tell, but I think that's a really valuable one for organizations that are at a certain level of maturity.
So when you think about, that sounds like a really well-developed point of view around design systems. When you think about your point of view about how design systems have impacted agencies and how they've impacted your clients' way of thinking, what are some themes that get extracted from this? What are the ways that your clients take on your point of view?
I would say that the biggest thing is, who are your customers? Understanding what the value is of the thing that you're building to each of those customers and being able to come up with some process and some strategy to be able to make sure that you're serving the needs of the people that you're serving. And whether that's your developers or your designers or your product people, each consumer of the system has a different priority. And it takes some time to be able to think about that. And that's a good thing about being from the agency side, is that we've sort of seen different ways of this sort of approach play out differently. Whether you are really, really heavy on your design and spec side up front, or you're really heavy on product design and you want to build something within a product that then gets elevated into a system. All these things sort of take a different path, and being able to approach that from what's the most important thing for us from a business standpoint to be able to hit? And then the step beyond that is, okay, in order to hit that business goal, how are we going to make the individual successful in that ecosystem so that it actually provides value in operation?
No, I love that idea of almost like, you kind of said it without saying it, like, hey, there's a product here that is that design system and they're consumers of that product. And there's, yes, the definition of that product that's important, but that consumption model can be really broadly varied based on the individual needs of an individual company.
Yeah, and I think that's what is really interesting to us, especially when we want to look at it as a problem to solve in the organizations that we work with, right? A lot of organizations we work with. In fact, I was a leader at a large telecom organization, and I think it was a very siloed organization. And the way in which we deployed a design system into that organization was very different than one that would maybe be more deeply collaborative in terms of how those business units or organizations work together, right? We had to create a bunch of tooling and a bunch of documentation, and we had to create a marketing strategy, right, where we advocated for the value in different and unique ways, and we had to create tools that really made it simple to integrate into a variety of different technology stacks that existed across the business, right? A lot of complexity, a lot of different personalities. And I think our product go-to-market strategy, I guess is the term you could use, is different than it is for, maybe another organization. I think there's some consistency, but I think you have to be respectful of the unique cultural world that exists within the organization that you operate.
And the goal here, right, is adoption broadly. Like what you're trying to drive at is the variations in tooling, service model, strategy. It's all about getting the right formula for adoption, product market fit, if you will, within an organization. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's funny. The analogy that comes to mind to me is Tesla and the charging network. If you were to build a Tesla and it does everything that you want it to do, it's got the range that you need, it's got all the things that you need. But in practice, without the charging network, it really doesn't provide any value to the consumers of that thing. So if you were to buy a Tesla and there was no charging network, you would be severely limited in how that would function for you in your daily life. But being able to have the things in place that drive adoption, that allow people to be able to use it the way they want to use it, make them feel like they're getting value out of it, and actually be able to empirically prove that is a really critical piece. You could build the best design system on the planet where it does everything that you want it to do, but if it's not in use, in products, in people's hands, you haven't actually contributed to the ROI that you may have espoused in the beginning of this to say, well, we should invest in this. That money just lays on the floor if you're not actually making use of the tool.
No, getting to value is absolutely about somebody using it in a production product.
Yeah, and I think that's what impresses upon me, and I think us at Crux, how important it is to think about a design system through the lens of a product. Because if you think about it strictly through building that Tesla, right, that's one dimensional view of it. But if you look at the ecosystem around it, right, the people who actually use it in the real world, the teams that are going to need to incorporate it and adopt it within their technology, their, how they have to sell it to their leadership because it's going to take a certain amount of adoption and time to do that. You have to think about all of those parts as a part of your product strategy in a lot of ways first before you actually think about the product itself, the design system in this situation. Because if you don't get those figured out, it doesn't matter how good or how effective or how fast or how whatever if nobody uses it and adopts it, right? So I think that's the bottom line for us.
And I think that the tendency is often to look at the tech and be like, wow, this is cool tech. This can enable a lot of stuff. And to really build the product around the tech as the focus. And I kind of feel like that's almost backward, where it is a lot more about understanding what an organization really needs or what they're really looking for in terms of service model, right? Like, how does this actually get adopted and get used? And then making the tech decisions based upon that. I know that there's a lot of different ways to go here, right? But I am kind of curious about how you guys think about the interplay of the tech, the tools, how people use it, how people put all this together. And sort of what is the sequence here? Like, what's the best practice for how you think about setting these up so that they're actually going to get used?
Yeah, you're hitting on a soapbox for me. So I'm gonna jump in here. So I think at the end of the day, I think at the end of the day, right? So I'm an engineer in background, so I'm very familiar and comfortable with the let's build some really cool tech, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really cool tech is fun and exciting, and it attracts, people to come and do it. And I think that's valuable, right? It's really important to have people excited about the technology that you're building. But at the end of the day, based on what we've been saying over the last few minutes, at the end of the day, you can have the best tech in the world, and if you don't have the systems around it and the tools around it to drive adoption, it's not going to be effective. So I think our point of view collectively is that, really in a lot of ways, thinking about tooling and process and value statements first often is going to get you much further than building the technology first and then figuring out how to wrap everything else around it. Now, I think there's always a balance there, and every organization is different in some ways. But I think the most successful design systems that I've seen built and deployed within an organization are those that started with the idea that we're going to have to create the infrastructure and the scaffolding first to get people excited about the idea, understand the value, understand how they're going to adopt it and integrate it into their product, and then deliver the actual design system to the real world. Now, a lot of that can happen in parallel, of course, but I think without doing that, I think there's a miss that is going to affect adoption in the long term.
So practically, what does that look like? I'm kind of curious from the more nuts and bolts perspective. How do you get that early alignment? How do you get people to touch something and to get excited about it?
Yeah, I think that it's really, really easy to fall down the rabbit hole of basically picking up a megaphone and yelling at people that they should use something. And I think that that's really ineffective. What I've seen be most effective is actually being able to do a barn raising, talking with your consumers and understanding what value they need. What are they missing? How are they using things today? What technologies are they using? What do they have in place? And surveying kind of your consumer base to understand the technical landscape and know what actually use that as input from an architectural standpoint to figure out how can we build something that's going to be the highest value to the largest group of people, and then try and prioritize based on business value maybe, or you've come up with your own algorithm on where the value really is, but who are we serving first, and bring them into your inner circle, and be able to co-create with people who are going to be receiving value with this, and build a sense of ownership. I think that's a really important piece. Is you can deliver something to somebody and find out after you've delivered it that it was the wrong thing, and that's true in all of product, right?
Right.
But yeah, from a technical standpoint, I think that's important. Going back to the design, though, I think there's a lot upstream of that process.
There's another really interesting point in terms of some of the tools that I've seen successful in driving this adoption and getting the consumption that you want. We had previously built a tool that we called BERT, which is sort of a blast radius tool. And it was a tool of measuring how much adoption the design system have had across the monorepo or all the repositories that were consuming it. And there was this very real emotional sort of guilt component in terms of, hey, all these other teams are using it and getting value, and we can quantify that value in these ways. And we start to put some basic math models around, hey, this consumption is meaning this amount of development efficiency is happening in this business unit over here. Why aren't you guys also, starting to realize some of these benefits that we can sort of point to and put some objective measurement around? And it starts to, in a lot of ways, like a virus, maybe that's a sensitive topic these days, but it's like a virus within that organization, right? Where people see the adoption, they can measure the adoption, they can see how that's impacting other teams, and we can measure at a design system level how it's permeating across the organization. I think that's another really, really important tool.
Right. So there's ROI on the table here. It's just a matter of telling the teams go grab it. And a part of it is social pressure around let's go ahead and, maybe not shame people, but let's go at least talk about who's using this and who isn't, and who's been able to go over to that table and pick up that value.
Yeah, social pressure is a really important part, in my opinion, of driving adoption, right? The more that you can quantify, communicate, and build excitement around it and spread that excitement across the organization, I think the better in a lot of ways.
And there's also a kind of an operational, going back to the upstream activities topic, is that it's not just on developers, right? I think there's a stream here that needs to be kind of hardened, right? You have your system. The designs that the developers get start with the design team, right? Mm-hmm. If the design team is bought into this to the point where there's actually a flow where the comps or whatever it looks like that developer is getting is actually aligned with the system that they're using to build it, it makes it really easy for that developer to go in and say, cool, I'm going to grab that off the shelf. And now I'm done. I actually got this done way faster than I thought. That's a really good outcome. A really bad outcome is when you have designers who aren't necessarily on board with what's going on, and the comps that those developers are getting are not aligned with patterns and approaches that would make them successful.
Right.
And so there's sort of this cascading effect of how do you make all of the stakeholders in the system and the people who are contributing to this make the person downstream of them successful? And that's sort of like herding cats in the beginning, right? You've got people who very much have their own perspective on how they want to do something, and changing people's behavior is really hard.
And we also have this, interesting phenomenon that occurs, right? Where to have a system that allows you to democratize that creative process, to allow anybody to participate in some meaningful way in the construction of a new digital application, a new website, a new native app, it requires a much greater amount of democratization in the building of that initial system. Likewise, we talk about this in the same way we think about power structures and communication structures inside of design systems, right? The person that has the ability to click publish on that next version of that design system is a really powerful person in that organization now, because that publish button might go out to hundreds or thousands of products. And so this is an interesting sort of observation around the service model associated with design, right? We have tooling and tech that enables all this to be possible. But the thing here that feels really hard is getting the people to work within a service model that embraces this democratization story.
Yeah, I think the way that I look at that, right, is a mixture of control, right? How do you put processes in place that allow the evolution of the design system to happen in a sane, well-controlled way? I think on the other side, how do you create a bunch of tools to allow contribution models to thrive, right? And I think if you can find a balance between, some centralized system that owns the product strategy of the design system, right? And owns, the releases and kind of the broad brushstrokes of how the design system is going to evolve over time, but allow all the consumers of that design system to inject ideas and to influence and to, submit merge requests, right, to that design system and participate in some meaningful way in governing how that design system evolves over time. I think you can strike a good balance. I think it's hard to operationalize that governance, but I think where we've seen it done most effectively is just through a structure of allowing feedback that's meaningfully listened to and acted upon, right? It can start as simple as just opening dialogue with your teams and taking their suggestion into the product and continuing to show that you care and that you're evolving the product to meet their needs. I think it can start there and get a lot more complicated over time too.
Yeah, it's all about building trust, right? I think that part of that is the feedback cycle, right? There's and there's also trust in the product, right? It's really easy it's really hard to build trust. It's really easy to lose trust, right? So whether that's in your communication cycles and how you're managing feedback and acting on feedback, or how you're actually controlling the quality of the product you're providing. And I think some of that comes down to really, really complex pipelines and DevOps, and how do you manage Semver, and how are you sure that you're not creating breaking changes for those hundreds or thousands of products downstream? There's a lot of work that needs to go into building the foundations that create a trustworthy product.
What I love about what you said about trust is it's trust in the product, trust in the system, but also trust between people. And I think that's an interesting kind of after effect of all this, right? Is like we create all these systems and processes and tools, but fundamentally it's all a way of ensuring a trust and a handshake between individual people in the chain, right? And I think that's this kind of interesting and somewhat surprising, I guess would be the right word, somewhat surprising way of thinking about it as design systems. It's not like there's one specific governance model that always works for change control. It's not like there's one specific, way of inserting designs into your design system or way of getting code out of it that always works the same way. But fundamentally, what you focus on in having a successful system is the adoption and the trust in the people in the system and in each other.
Yeah, and I would say that like the maintenance of trust comes down to the team's ability to be able to handle the complexity that they're creating. I think that what ends up happening is that these systems grow and grow and grow. And then at some point, it's usually when you're thinking about breaking changes, you're thinking about, oh, well, am I changing an API somewhere? It's a really technical concept. Design breaking changes occur as well, right? And when you put these two things together, you're actually increasing the complexity of the system and how you govern that end to end, right? And I think that actually over time, as you're growing the consumption and evolving the system, that actually introduces new challenges that most development teams don't have to deal with, because usually it's just, oh, well, we got acquired, turn it blue, or it's we're going to a new brand, completely apply this across all of our properties.
I'm curious if you guys have experienced the bounce. Like when we were an agency and even somewhat as a product company, we always see a lot of excitement early on in a design systems project and an implementation. And people are stoked about building core principles. And they're stoked about getting some docs in there. And they're stoked about like the first stand-up, the first consumer, and the first pilot component. And then what happens is like the work settles in for a year or 18 months. And then people kind of look at it as like this thing that's done, and it doesn't get as much attention, as much excitement. And we always sort of see this like almost this second implementation hump that you really need to push through, because a lot of design systems fundamentally fail after about 18 months, not because they weren't well established, but because they fell off.
Well, I'm gonna pull us back to a concept we talked about a little bit earlier around marketing. I think a lot of that comes down to storytelling, right? And I've seen this firsthand in a design system that I was the owner of in terms of the build part of it, at least. And what we saw is precisely that. We saw a ton of excitement, a ton of people excited about the concept of a design system and what it could mean. And then we saw 6 months of the trial of terror, right, where everybody was very upset that
everything's broken
so long. Yeah, everything was broken. The migration and consumption of these components was hard, and we learned a ton, right? All these different things happened. But I think what pulled us out of that trough was really a story that started to emerge about impact. And I think you have to be super intentional about doing this, because it's easy to get tired about talking about it, tired of pounding the drum about how important it'll be, whatever it is. You have to pull yourself out of it and start to take that quantifiable data about the impact, about the improvements and the efficiency and what it helped us do, and the story of a market or new product that we brought to market in 50% of the time that we did previously, or whatever these wins are that start to build up. And sometimes you have to be really you have to pay a ton of attention, because early on those wins are not abundantly obvious, but they're there, right? And you have to have the eye to look for them.
Hey, we shipped a button. Good for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but even that win can be amplified, right? That can be amplified. That can go into a deck to your leaders. That can go into a conversation with, the executive team or whoever is a stakeholder ultimately of the business, right? And you can be a marketer for that product. You can be a marketer and figure out how to like spread the word and yell at the top of the mountains, hey, this is working, this matters. It's small now, but it's going to build and grow over time.
Wow, I love that.
There's also this concept of where is your product market fit and what is the threshold to be able to release something, where if you can actually come up with, based off of who you're shipping to, what's going to provide real value and start to celebrate as early as possible without shipping too early, right? I think you have to be very intentional about when you actually go to market with it. But it gives you more opportunities to amplify, right? We've got 5 core components. Great. Somebody's getting something out of that. 6 through 20 can all be signals that start to, that amplify all of that progress. And you start to impact more consumers across more projects. And that becomes a more compelling story as you go.
I love the reason why I love that so much is because it's very similar to how we think about this too. When somebody first touches Knapsack for the first time, there is this idea of what is the win that we can get today in Knapsack? What is the win that we can get by the end of the week? And what our customer success motion ends up being is it's largely like, let us write the deck for you to get executive alignment for the next step of your design system. Let us write the presentation that you're going to give at a lunch and learn that shows your other product teams how great the work is that you're doing. Let us provide you with the metrics that show like how effective this is being for your organization, because this is still new, right? Like there's not a lot of organizations that have either paid an agency or bought a SaaS product or anything as it relates to design systems. And so Oftentimes, these are internal efforts led by small teams that are somewhat insurgent, that maybe aren't aligned on some executive KPI dashboard somewhere. And so empowering them with the tools to be able to spread the love a little and make themselves look good while actually presenting this really amazing concept to their organization, that's where a lot of magic happens.
Yeah, I can tell you firsthand that in the first year of building a design system at scale, a good 40% of my job was creating metrics to be able to make my stakeholder, who happened to be Zach, successful in his position. So being able to go through and do all that, that's why we created the Blast Radius tool. We used that to be able to create objective metrics that Zach could then go bring and tell the story about where that investment is going and what the impact is of that. And if you don't have those storytelling pieces to be able to communicate upwards to somebody who's not a design system expert, somebody who really more cares about how quickly am I getting to market, how efficient are my teams, what's my return on investment, the storytelling upward is different than the storytelling that you're telling to your consumers. But both of those stories are valuable to be able to create that traction and that ongoing investment.
Yeah, and to drive a point home there, right? My stakeholders in that organization were not focused on how many components we consumed or how many, design system alignments we had across the products in my portfolio. They cared about how many hours it took to build and deliver a feature to our customers. They cared about, the bottom line, right, of the operating of my business at least. And so, the more that we can tie the value at the design system and developer operations level to the results that drives to the business, however small they were. And they were very small at the beginning, to be very clear. They were very small. But those are still really important stories that can be amplified and yelled out at the top of the mountain, right? About how we can do this times 10 if we continue to make this investment. And that worked, right? Because it told a story about how, one, we're already winning, and two, we're going to win a whole bunch more if we keep nose to the grindstone on this initiative.
Yeah, I mean, the value goes exponential really quickly in design systems, right? The thing that sounds like you're saving like a handful of seconds, well, multiplied across 1,000-person developer team, that's a meaningful amount of time. If you're able to make 100 changes that all save a few seconds here or a few minutes here, that starts to create incredible value at scale. And I think that's the thing that is always interesting to me about that trough and adoption, right? It's like, okay, so some business unit or some group has proven this well enough that it works for them, but to really take advantage of the design system, it has to scale. And that scale conversation seems to be where people end up getting hung up a lot, because I think it's what you guys said. That story isn't being told, or there's not the proof points and data that represent that. One other thing on this, I do love the idea of thinking about metrics a little bit differently, right? You have metrics that are those bottom line metrics, those business drivers that you were talking about. That's the stuff that goes to your executives. That's what gets you alignment and fundamentally what gets you budget to either build it yourself, hire an agency, get a SaaS product, whatever it is that represents the next evolution of your design system. But then there's this separate set of things that you have to talk about with your design system team and your consumers of your design system that really show them the benefit too, in a much less like business metrics driven way, and in a much more thing that's a lot personal to what they value out of a design system.
Yeah. So, we look at that through the lens of different customer segments, right? Every product has different customer segments, and I think a design system has different customer segments, right? One is the higher level business leaders or stakeholders, right, who want a certain amount of efficiency or growth of the business or whatever those things are, and then the consumers who are a part of your strategy to get there, right? And so the story that you tell between those 2 or 3 or 4 different sort of customer segments is going to be different in some ways. And it's going to be important to understand what their motivators are, why they're buying the design system, what do they get out of it, what is their value statement, which in some cases, especially in a large organization, can be very diverse, right? Very diverse. But I think the more that you think like a traditional marketer and think about those customer segments and what messaging is going to resonate, what messaging is not going to resonate, I think serves you well at scale, because it's not one story, right? It's multiple sometimes.
Yeah, and that also drives how much you need to build into your system also, right? It's not just the design, it's not just the components that you're delivering. It's the documentation of the patterns. It's the reason why. And it's creating a central point for somebody to be able to go spin up on that and be effective with it in very little time. And an interesting anecdote here that I had with a client recently was that we've been working for 2 years now on building design patterns and input to be able to drive development of those patterns. And we had a conversation, and he said to me, well, we don't have a design system. And for a moment, I was like, well, what are you talking about? We've got all the designs. We've built all of this stuff. It's in use. It's in consumers' hands. But you don't think we have a design system? He said, well, no, I don't have a place where I can point a new developer to go, or a new designer or a product person to be able to consume this in its entirety and understand the value, and also be able to be effective at using it on their first day on the job.
A really great metric.
And I thought that was a really effective, it was a really, really good insight that we created all of this value and it's in use, it's providing real value, but there's ROI being left on the table, to your earlier point, is that you just got to pick it up, right? And so when you scale across silos, and I'm going to use that as like the dirty enterprisey terms, it's like people who don't communicate with one another and don't have visibility into what you've built, they need to be able to see that value, buy in on that value, and get value out of it quickly. And as you scale, you need more of those tools.
Yeah, I think there's a cool analog there to also like that pilot example, right? The whole thing about like you can overbuild a system early on and then realize that you've maybe built the wrong thing, or you haven't built something that really truly reflects the value you're intending, because you never piloted it. You never put it in an implementation while you're building it. And it's one of the things that we encourage people to do all the time, right? Is like, get to the minimum shippable thing right away so that you can really understand it. That then carries forward to your point about like, okay, you might have a fully built, really highly functional system, but if there's still a challenge with that adoption or that gate or that friction early on, the focus shouldn't be like how I extend the design system. The focus should be like how I reduce that friction.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that probably comes into, sometimes people will use things like Storybook or kind of the off-the-shelf tooling to be able to provide that visibility with the smallest amount of effort. What sometimes is overlooked is that that's not an effort that one person or one discipline can complete. That's something it's a design effort, it's a development effort, but it's also surveying the consumers of that and making sure that you're providing the right information in the right context to be able to provide that value out of the gate. And sometimes maybe that's a fully custom doc site, right? Where you're actually using the components that you're building to dog food and build the thing that you're using to document it, right? In any way that you can actually take that value that you're adding and consume it yourself, the better it's going to be when you have consumers that are actually pulling it in.
Absolutely. I've always kind of chuckled a little bit at the organizations that we talk to. They're like, oh, we have a design system. We have a bunch of components in Storybook with some note stocks. And it's like, by the way, this is not a dig on Storybook. I actually think it's a really incredible tool.
Yeah, agreed.
But that is not a design system. That is a beginnings of a component library. A component library and a design system are not the same thing, because one of them, you've really thought about this interdisciplinary, cross-functional democratization approach to adoption, and in the other, you have a really nice reusable library of components. And those don't necessarily represent the same thing to an organization.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, right? What lacks in that is an understanding of the strategy that you're deploying within that organization to drive that adoption. And I think just a bucket of components is one thing. And I think there's a good Lego analogy, right? A bunch of Legos in a box is one thing. There's value there, right? There's building blocks. You can go from there. But it's another to have like an instruction manual in terms of how to piece all of those Legos together into some like broader, more exciting structure. And I think that's
eventually you get a Millennium Falcon and you're super stoked.
Yeah,
it takes up your whole living room.
Exactly. And then I forget about all the other work I need to do and play with that instead. But at the end of the day, I think that's really kind of the missing key in a lot of organizations is really that guide, both in documentation form, to Aaron's point, but also in terms of like the champion and the communication around that design system, right? Articulating the strategy, articulating the why, and all the other pieces and parts that are going to drive adoption where they really need to be in an organization.
There are two kind of ways that I've seen this play out, which are kind of interesting. One is sort of the spec approach, and one is the product design approach, where they both kind of lead to totally different places. Where you have, I've consumed a really, really well developed spec that came from design teams that had done user research, and they came up with everything all the way down to accessibility details about how are we using ARIA labels, and then all the pixel, everything all the way down to tokens. And then, okay, go build off of that, where you kind of have the directions, right? From as a developer, when you're walking into that, you have the directions. And then on the other side of it, it's we have all these patterns in place in the context of an application, and we know how this application is supposed to function, but we haven't actually gone through the process of dissecting those things into how the individual patterns function or the individual components function. And those two things, I think, lead to very, very different outcomes in the same amount of time. And it really depends on what the business goals, what do you need to hit in 6 months or a year as to which approach you take and how much money you have to invest in it. But they both end in very different places that also have very different adoptions.
That's a lot to think about there. I like that framing of that part of the conversation about, like, you know, you have a lot of different paths and they lead to different places, but ultimately the value represented by those different paths is still tied to this product that you're building together. So you guys have built a ton of these things for lots of different people. You've probably got one of the more interesting viewpoints of this overall landscape that I've heard. You deal with a lot of big companies, you build a lot of design systems. You probably have a pretty opinionated stance on what's next here. And I'm always kind of curious to talk to people in this industry about, like, okay, you know, you started to do these things 4-ish years ago. Give me some speculation on what the next, you know, couple of years looks like in the design systems realm.
Yeah, let me kind of look at into the crystal ball a little bit, because I do have this. It's going to be a very clear picture that I'm going to paint. No, just kidding about that.
I feel like it's a setup.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I see things evolving, especially when you look at enterprise application development, I think a lot of it is going to focus first on how do we start at scale. I think when my time spending in, you know, large enterprise organizations, a lot of the internal thought is really about efficiency, right? How do we do more with less? Because we're being held to, you know, quarter by quarter growth, right, from a revenue perspective, and we need to figure out how to do more with less at the end of the day. And so I think a lot of enterprise application development is going to start with design systems in a lot of ways. I mean, every organization that we're talking to or engaged with in some way is starting to make these investments. And so I think they're going to look at these design systems as the place to start when starting to create a product from 0 to 100, right? So I think you're going to see a lot more, you know, initial implicit beginnings with the components that exist in the design systems, whether they already exist or they're just, you know, designs and or components in Storybook or whatever. The conversation is going to start there. What do we have? What can we build from to get to where we want to be? I hope certainly that there's a lot less of the mentality internally within these enterprises that are, you know, how do we reinvent the wheel over and over again? Because I see my fair share of that for sure. But I do see a lot of that tide turning in the conversations that we have and in the time that I've spent. No, let's have a little bit more of a critical thought in terms of what exists in our ecosystem, whether it's components or existing products or whatever it is, and let's start there. So I think that's going to be one big trend that I see as we go forward into the next few years within the enterprise is more reusability from the beginning.
Gotcha. So people are going to start to have more familiarity with these systems. They're going to start to understand how they impact engineering and development. It's probably going to be less about insurgent teams and more about a more thoughtful approach, potentially from a higher level inside of the organization from day one.
And I think that will come about because people are getting more comfortable with using design systems, creating some sophistication in terms of how the design systems are used and consumed, and just more comfortable with the idea that, you know, the cost of creating software and building software is just very high. So what opportunities exist within our ecosystem to cut some corners, but still deliver a great product? And the other thing is, so many of these products, we're at an evolutionary phase of the enterprise where many enterprises, even if they're not, the most forward-thinking, most innovative organization have a very thick and big digital presence within their walls. And so I think they're going to be looking internally more to say, how can we leverage all these great digital assets we have to do more, better, and faster?
Yeah, and I think that surface area is only going to increase. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that people are demanding more and more digital experiences to meet them at home or wherever it is they are. So I think that layer is only going to get thicker. What about you, Aaron? Where do you see this all headed?
Well, I think where we are now is consumers of these types of products are getting more comfortable with the impact that it has on their daily life. I think that people are starting with, whether it's material design or it's any of the other kind of open source design systems that are out of the box that you could consume and evolve. People are used to grabbing something off the shelf, which I think is helping with, you reused that term earlier, of like raising your gaze and starting to think more at a product level and getting comfortable with how those things can be tools to help you as opposed to threatening elements in your daily life, right? I think that what we're going to see is that those kind of like out of the box tools have ceilings, right? And there's going to be more demand to be able to create those kind of proprietary, brand focused, customized design systems that aren't necessarily just sort of a replication of another brand. And the thing that's going to make that more operationalizable, if that's a word, is sort of like it ties in with kind of the DevOps movement in my mind. And this is going back to like my engineering background, is I think that as we evolve in the technology that we use to deliver these things, that is going to become more comfortable as well. And tooling is going to start to evolve around how we do this, so that we're spending more time actually building and deploying at the highest level of how we actually put this together, and not necessarily thinking about all the building blocks that it takes to build at scale right now. Right now, like Zach was saying, it's very expensive to do this, right? Starting from scratch on this stuff and thinking about all the accessibility implications and all of the other implications is expensive. It takes time. And I think we'll see a reduction in the cost to do this custom work as the tooling and the maturity of how we deliver and govern these things continues to evolve.
Yeah, I love that.
And that's what I get really excited about, is at that place in reality, the energy that an organization spends is going to be on the things that really matter, right? The things that are unique to the solution that they're building or the product that they're marketing or their, whatever problem they're trying to solve as a business. And I think that's in the nirvana state, right? At the end of the day, is taking all of the reusable, like cookie cutter stuff that already exists in your organization out of the equation, bring that to the table in a really clean, efficient, maintainable, reusable way, and focus your organizational horsepower on building the unique, great product that you're trying to bring to market. And we're not there, but I think with this in place and with this methodology in place, I think we can get there a lot quicker than we would otherwise.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for sharing your guys' thoughts. I really appreciate you being on. Love the conversation and look forward to chatting again sometime in the future. Hopefully, as people start to add things like Knapsack to solve this problem.
Exactly. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Cheers. Have a great day. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.